You know already how to set properties in SAML with the attribute syntax. On this button, the attribute syntax is used to set the button's content property to @customer. In the previous clip, you learned how to set properties in SAML with the property element syntax. Setting the button's content property with this syntax looks like this. The property element consists of the class name and the property name separated by a dot. Property element syntax allows you to assign complex objects to a property, because you can use again object elements inside of the property element. The syntax that I want to show you in this clip is the content syntax, that is also known as content property syntax. It means that you can place content directly inside of an object element. In this case, you place the text @customer directly inside of the button element. Actually, this content syntax is like the property element syntax. You just omit the property element, which would be in this case button.content. But now the question with this content syntax is, why is here the value assigned to the button's content property and not to another property? How does the SAML parser know that it has to use the content property of the button? Let me explain you how this works. In WPF, the SAML document is read by the SAML parser. When reading the document, the SAML parser creates the objects from that SAML document. Now, when the SAML parser sees this button, it notices that the button element has content directly inside. The content is not assigned to a property by using a property element. This means that the SAML parser needs to find out to which property it should assign that content. To do this, the SAML parser looks for the content property attribute. In our sample here, it looks for that attribute on the button class, as the button element contains the content. The SAML parser finds the content property attribute on the content control class, which is a base class of button. As you can see, the content property attribute specifies the name of the property that the SAML parser should use, which is in this case the content property. In the last step, the SAML parser uses the property specified in the content property attribute and assigns the value. That means in this case of the button, it assigns the value @customer to the button's content property. So this is how the content syntax works, and it is used quite often in SAML. Actually, content syntax is always used when you put content in an object element without property element. Let me show you now in a demonstration that you set already properties with the content syntax in our code. Let's switch to Visual Studio. Here I've opened the main window SAML file of our WPF project. Now you see here in the window element there is directly a grid element and no property element is used. So here the question is already, to which property of the window is this grid object assigned? You can find this out by right-clicking here the window element. Then from the context menu you select Go to Definition. Now you can see here the window class. When you expand this here, you see it does not have the content property attribute. So let's right-click on the base class and let's select here Go to Definition. Now let's expand here the attributes, and here you see the content property attribute that defines the content property as a default property. So now let's go back to the main window SAML file. Now you know that this grid instance is assigned to the Window's content property. If you want, you can explicitly write here a property element window.content to assign that grid to the content property of the window. Let's also add the closing element. Now let's continue with the grid. It contains directly this button. So, to which property of the grid is the button assigned? Let's right-click the grid and let's select Go to Definition. When you look at the grid class, you don't see any attributes. So let's right-click its base class panel and let's select Go to Definition. Now let's look at the attributes of the panel class, and here you see the content property attribute that defines the children property as a content property. So let's go again to the main Windows SAML document, and now you can explicitly write here also grid.children, and then you put the button inside of that grid.children property element. Next, there is the button that has a property element to set its content property, and then there is the stack panel that contains directly an image and a text block. The stack panel inherits like grid from panel. So also here the children property is used that you could specify explicitly with a property element. Let's write here stackPanel.children. Now let's run the application and let's see if everything still works. The application comes up and here you can see the button with the image and the text block. So everything still works the same way as before. But as you can see, SAML gets much more verbose when you explicitly specify all these optional property elements. Usually, on a window, you want to set the content property. On a panel like grid and stack panel, you want to set the children property. And on a content control like button, you want to set the content property. Now, the content syntax allows you to omit all these property elements. Then SAML gets more compact and more readable. So let's remove here again the window content property element. Let's remove the grid children property element. Let's remove here also the button content property element. And let's remove the stack panel children property element. Now I also need to remove all the closing property elements. Stack panel children, button content, grid children, and window content. I press Ctrl KD to format this document, and now you can see the SAML document is much more compact and much more readable than before. As you can see, the stack panel is now directly inside of the button. But when you look at the button space class, which is content control, you can see that the content property is specified with the content property attribute as a default property. Important to know is that even with the content syntax, you can still use other property elements inside of the button, for example button.background, to assign a brush to the button's background property. Now let me remove this again. Alright, so far to content syntax. In the next clip, you will learn about another syntax that is called collection syntax.